My name doesn't matter anymore to most people in this town. What matters to them is the word they use when they think I can't hear it. Crazy. That fisherman who lost his mind out there. I have carried that word for 11 years now, the way a ship carries barnacles on its hull, something that clings to you no matter how many times you scrape it away. But tonight, for reasons I still don't fully understand, I've decided to tell this story one more time. Maybe the last time, because there is a limit to how long a man can stay silent about the thing that changed his life forever. I was 44 years old when it happened, captain of a modest fishing vessel called the Maritime, 41 feet of steel and salt-worn wood that I had sailed for almost 2 decades. I want you to understand something before I go any further. I was not a superstitious man. I did not believe in ghosts, in curses, in sea monsters whispered about in dockside bars after too much whiskey. I believed in charts, in compass headings, in the weight of a net full of fish, in the particular ache in your shoulders after a 16-hour shift. I believed in things you could touch. That is the man I was before that voyage. That is not the man who came back. It started as an ordinary run. We left port on a gray morning in late September, the kind of morning where the sky and the sea seem made of the same dull metal, indistinguishable from each other at the horizon line. I had a crew of 4 with me. Good men. Men I trusted with my life, because at sea, trust is not a luxury. It is oxygen. There was Elias, my first mate, a quiet man in his 50s, who had sailed with me longer than anyone. There was Thomas, young and eager, barely 26, always cracking jokes to cut the tension. There was Walt, our engineer, a heavy-set man who spoke to the engine room like it was a living thing he had to coax and comfort. And there was Danny, the youngest of us all, 22, on his 3rd voyage with me, still learning the rhythm of the ocean. We were heading toward a stretch of water that older captains in our harbor called, half jokingly, half seriously, the Dead Reach. It wasn't on any official chart with that name. It was just a nickname passed down through generations of fishermen, referring to a patch of ocean roughly 90 miles offshore, where the fish were plentiful, but where compasses sometimes behaved strangely, where fog rolled in without warning, even on clear days, where more than one boat had reported instrument failures over the decades. I had fished those waters a dozen times before without incident. I saw no reason this trip would be any different. The first few hours passed exactly as they should. The engine hummed steady beneath our feet. Tomas told a story about a woman he'd met in port that made Walt laugh so hard he had to sit down on an overturned bucket to catch his breath. The nets went out clean, and we pulled in a good haul before noon, more than I expected for that time of year. I remember standing at the helm with a cup of coffee going cold in my hand, watching the gulls circle behind us, thinking this was shaping up to be one of the easier trips of the season. I remember that feeling specifically, the false comfort of a calm sea, because I would not feel anything like it again for 97 days. By late afternoon, the fog came. It didn't roll in gradually the way fog usually does, thinning and thickening at the edges. It arrived like someone had drawn a curtain across the world all at once, swallowing the horizon in a single breath. One moment I could see for miles. The next, I could barely see the bow of my own ship. Elias came up beside me, and I noticed his jaw was tight, the way it got when something troubled him that he didn't want to say out loud. "Never seen it come in like that," he said quietly. I told him it was just the Dead Reach living up to its name. I believed that when I said it. I want you to remember that I believed it, because belief is the first thing the ocean took from me, piece by piece, over the following weeks. We decided to hold our position rather than risk running blind through unfamiliar currents. I dropped anchor, set a watch rotation, and told the men to get some rest. I remember the particular silence of that night, not the comfortable silence of an empty sea, but something heavier, something that pressed against your ears like the pressure of deep water. I stood on deck a long while before turning in, staring into fog that gave nothing back, and for the first time in my career, I felt something I can only describe as a held breath in the air itself, as if the ocean around us was waiting for something to happen. Danny took the first watch. He was nervous, I could tell, though he tried not to show it in front of the older men. I told him to wake me if anything at all felt wrong, and he nodded with the seriousness of a boy trying hard to be a man. I lay in my bunk, listening to the water lap against the hull, a sound I had fallen asleep to 1,000 nights of my life, and yet that night it sounded different, slower somehow, as if even the waves were reluctant to move. I told myself it was exhaustion. I told myself a lot of things that night that turned out not to be true. I woke once, near midnight, to what I thought was Danny's footsteps on deck, and I almost got up to check on him, but sleep pulled me back down before I could act on it. In hindsight, I wonder now whether that moment already belonged to the loop, whether I had already lived that exact half-waking instant more times than I would ever be able to count. That is the cruelty of what happened to us. You cannot know. You are trapped in a repeating day until something breaks the pattern, and by then, you have already lost time you can never get back. Days folded inside other days, like the pages of a book pressed too tightly together. I went to sleep telling myself it was exhaustion talking, that tomorrow the fog would burn off with the morning sun, and we would haul in another good catch and be back in port within the week, telling stories at the bar about the strange night the sea went quiet. I woke up the next morning at exactly 6:13, and my life as I understood it ended, though I did not know it yet. I want you to hold on to that number, 6:13, because for the next 97 days, it would be the first thing I saw every single time I opened my eyes, a small red glow on the cabin clock, patient and unchanging, like a door that only opened onto the same room. I want to describe that first strange morning carefully, because looking back, every detail of it mattered more than I understood at the time. I woke to the smell of Walt's coffee drifting from the galley, the particular clang of a wrench against the engine housing, Tomas's laugh carrying faintly through the hull. Ordinary sounds, comforting sounds. I climbed up to the deck expecting to see the fog burned away, the sun breaking through the way it usually does after a heavy night mist. Instead, I found the same wall of gray waiting for me, exactly as thick, exactly as still, as though nothing at all had happened while I slept. I didn't think much of it at first. Fog can linger for a day, sometimes two, especially in a place with the reputation the dead reach carried. I told the men to check the instruments, to plot a course out of the bank as soon as visibility allowed. Elias came to me an hour later with a look on his face I had never seen him wear before, a mixture of confusion and something closer to fear. "Raymond," he said, using my first name, which he almost never did. "You need to come look at this." I followed him to the chart table, where our GPS display showed our exact position, and it matched, almost to the meter, the coordinates from the morning before. I told him instruments drift, that a small error was nothing to worry about, that the ocean has a way of playing tricks on men who stare at numbers too long. He didn't argue with me, but I could see he didn't believe what I was telling him any more than I believed it myself. We spent that day motoring slowly, trying to find open water, and by evening, the fog thinned just enough to reveal the horizon, and there, sitting exactly where it had been the day before, floated a dead fish, bloated and pale, caught in an eddy near our hull. I remembered that fish. I had seen it the previous morning and thought nothing of it. Seeing it again in the same place sent a chill through me I could not explain away with logic. That night, the crew ate dinner in near silence, Thomas tried to make a joke about the fog being cursed, and nobody laughed. Not even Walt, who usually laughed at everything. Danny asked me directly if we were lost, and I told him no. We were not lost. We simply had bad luck with the weather. I believed my own words less and less each time I spoke them. I set the watch rotation again, told the men to rest, and lay awake far longer than I had the night before, listening to that same slow lapping of water against the hull, wondering if I was imagining the strange sensation that time itself had become thick, resistant, like wading through water up to my chest. I woke up the next morning at exactly 6:13. I remember lying there for a long moment before opening my eyes, some part of me already dreading what I would find. When I finally looked at the clock, and then out the small porthole above my bunk, the fog was there again, unchanged, patient, endless. I told myself it was a coincidence, that fog banks can sit in one place for days if the wind refuses to move them, that 90-some miles offshore was exactly the kind of place where weather could stall like a stubborn engine. I got dressed and went up to check on the men, already knowing, somewhere beneath my rational mind, that something was deeply wrong. Walt was the one who noticed the coffee. He swore up and down that he had used the last of our good grounds the morning before, and yet there they sat in the tin, exactly the same amount as when we'd left port, as though the previous day had never touched them at all. Thomas found his cigarettes back to a full pack when he distinctly remembered smoking 3 the day before. Small things a tired man might explain away individually, but taken together, spread across 4 separate crew members who had not spoken to one another about it. They formed a pattern too consistent to dismiss as fatigue or coincidence. I called the men together on deck that evening, the fog pressing close around us like a held breath, and I asked them plainly whether anyone else felt as though we were reliving the same day. The silence that followed told me everything. Danny was the first to speak, his young voice cracking slightly, admitting that he'd noticed the same dead fish twice, in the same position, at the same hour. Elias said the sun, on the rare occasions it broke through the mist, seemed to move across the sky at the exact same pace he remembered from the day before, casting shadows in identical places at identical times. We stood there, 5 grown men, staring at each other in a fog that refused to lift, each one afraid to say the word that was forming in all our minds. That was the moment I understood. This was not ordinary weather, not ordinary bad luck, not the kind of thing a captain could fix with a course correction or a patient wait for wind to shift. Something about this stretch of ocean was holding us, folding the hours back on themselves like a wave curling over and breaking in the same spot again and again. I did not have a word for it. Yet. None of us did. We only had the growing, sick certainty that whatever was happening to us was not natural, and that understanding it would require more courage than any of us had needed before in our lives at sea. I gave the order to attempt a full course change that night, plotting a heading due east, away from the dead reach entirely, hoping that raw distance might break whatever spell had settled over the meridian. We ran the engines for 6 straight hours, watching the GPS numbers climb steadily away from our anchor point, feeling for the first time in 2 days a flicker of hope that we might simply motor our way out of this. Walt reported the engine running clean, no trouble at all, and for a while I let myself believe we had already solved it, that tomorrow would bring open water and an end to this waking nightmare. I woke up the next morning at exactly 6:13, and when I climbed to the deck, my stomach turned to ice. The fog was there, the same fog, and beneath it, unmistakably, floated the same bloated pale fish, caught in the same eddy near our hull, as though the 6 hours of engine time, the miles of ocean we had supposedly crossed, had simply been erased, folded away like a page torn from a book and thrown into the sea behind us. There is a particular kind of fear that comes from a machine, telling you something your mind refuses to accept. Men can be frightened of storms, of sharks, of the black water beneath a hole at midnight, and still find a way to keep working, because those fears have shapes you can prepare for. But when the instruments themselves, the very tools you have trusted your whole career, begin reporting something impossible, the fear changes character entirely. It stops being an animal fear and becomes something closer to madness, a crack running through the floor of your own understanding of the world. I spent that morning locked in the wheelhouse with Elias, going over every log entry we had recorded since leaving port. Our position, according to 6 straight hours of engine time heading due east, should have placed us nearly 40 nautical miles from where we currently sat. Instead, the GPS reported coordinates within a few hundred yards of our original anchor point, the same patch of ocean we had first dropped anchor in 3 mornings before, though by then, none of us could say with certainty how many mornings it truly had been. Elias kept running his finger down the log page, murmuring the numbers under his breath, as if repetition might change them. I checked the equipment myself, tore into the housing of our secondary GPS unit, tested the compass against 3 separate reference points, even used an old sextant I kept in a drawer for emergencies, a relic from my father's era of sailing. Every single method gave me the same answer. We had moved, by every measure of fuel burned and engine hours logged, and yet we had gone nowhere at all. I remember sitting back in the captain's chair, my hands trembling slightly, staring at numbers that made no sense within any framework I understood, and feeling for the first time in my life that the ocean itself might be lying to me. Thomas, ever the one to break tension with humor, tried to joke that maybe we'd sailed into the Bermuda Triangle's forgotten cousin, some patch of sea nobody had bothered naming yet. Nobody laughed this time either. Danny sat quietly at the mess table, his young face pale, turning a coin over and over between his fingers, a nervous habit I would come to recognize over the following weeks as a sign that his fear was climbing toward panic. Walt kept disappearing below deck, checking and rechecking the engine, as though the answer to our impossible situation might be found somewhere in a fuel line or a bolt he had overlooked. I called the men together again that afternoon, the fog thick enough that I could barely see Danny sitting only 10 feet away from me, and I told them the truth as plainly as I could manage. I told them I did not understand what was happening, that in over 20 years at sea, I had never encountered anything remotely like this, and that our only path forward was to stay calm, to keep detailed records of everything we observed, and to keep trying every reasonable method of escape until one of them worked. I remember Elias nodding slowly, his weathered face set in the grim determination I had always admired in him, the look of a man who has decided to keep working regardless of how frightened he is underneath. We tried a new heading that evening, this time due south, running the engines even harder than before, pushing the Meridian to speeds I normally would have considered reckless in fog this thick. I stood at the helm for hours, watching the compass needle, watching the GPS numbers tick steadily away from our anchor point, feeling something close to relief building in my chest as the miles accumulated on the display. Walt shouted up from the engine room that we were burning fuel faster than expected, but that everything mechanical was sound, clean, running exactly as it should. For a few hours that night, I let myself hope harder than I had allowed myself to in days. Danny asked me, somewhere near midnight, whether I thought we would make it home in time for his sister's wedding, which he had mentioned once before, early in the voyage, back when such plans still seemed to belong to an ordinary and predictable future. I told him yes, of course, though even as the words left my mouth, I felt a hollowness behind them I did not want him to see. He smiled anyway, the tired, hopeful smile of a young man who wanted badly to believe his captain, and went below to try to sleep, leaving me alone at the helm with only the fog and the low, steady growl of the engine for company. I stayed awake as long as I could that night, determined to see with my own eyes whether the coordinates held steady into the early hours, whether this new heading might finally be the one to break us free of whatever unnatural hold the dead reach had on our ship. Elias joined me near 2 in the morning, unable to sleep either, and we sat together in near silence, 2 men watching numbers on a screen the way other men might watch a dying campfire, hoping against reason that it would not go out. Around 4 in the morning, exhaustion finally overtook me, and I allowed myself to close my eyes for what I intended to be only a few minutes. I woke up the next morning at exactly 6:13. The dread that settled into my chest before I even opened my eyes was heavier than anything I had felt the 2 mornings before, because some part of me had genuinely believed, for the first time, that we were close to breaking free. I climbed to the deck already knowing, with a certainty that felt like ice water poured slowly down my spine, exactly what I would find. The fog, the same eddy, the same bloated fish, still floating there as though mocking every mile we had supposedly traveled through the black hours of the night. Elias found me standing at the rail, staring out into that endless gray nothing, and he didn't say a word. He simply stood beside me, close enough that our shoulders nearly touched, the 2 of us looking out at a horizon that gave nothing back, sharing a silence that said more than either of us could have managed with language. I remember thinking, in that moment, that whatever force held us here did not care about our engines, our fuel, our carefully plotted headings, or even our fear. It cared about something else entirely, something none of us yet understood, and until we understood it, we were not going anywhere at all, by what I calculated to be our 7th repetition of that same day, though I confess my counting grew unreliable even then. The fog broke just long enough to reveal something far worse than empty gray. A storm was building on the horizon, dark clouds stacking on top of each other, like a wall being built brick by brick, and beneath it, the sea had begun to churn with a restlessness that told every man aboard we were in for a rough night. I remember feeling something almost like relief at the sight of it. A storm, at least, was something I understood. A storm was an enemy with rules. We battened down everything we could in the hour before it hit, lashing loose equipment, checking that the hatches were sealed tight, running through the same drills I had run 100 times before in my career. Elias worked without needing instruction, his hands moving with the practiced calm of a man who had weathered worse. Thomas and Danny secured the nets and gear on deck, while Walt made one final check of the engine room, shouting up that everything was as ready as it could be. For a brief moment, working together against a clear and physical threat, the strange dread of the past days lifted slightly from all our shoulders. The storm hit just after dusk, and it hit hard. Waves rose higher than I had seen in years, slamming against the hull with a force that sent shudders through the entire vessel. Rain came sideways, driven by wind that screamed through the rigging like something alive and furious. I stood at the helm fighting the wheel with both hands, feeling the meridian rise and fall beneath me like a living animal in pain, my eyes straining against sheets of water to find any point of reference in a world gone entirely black and violent. Danny screamed something I couldn't hear over the wind, and Elias grabbed his arm, pulling him back from the rail just as a wave crashed over the side that would have taken him with it. I remember the lightning most of all, great jagged forks splitting the sky in patterns that seemed to burn themselves permanently into my vision, followed by thunder so close it felt like it was detonating inside my own chest. We fought that storm for nearly 4 hours, every man doing his job, every man drawing on reserves of strength and training that exist in a sailor's body for exactly these moments. When it finally passed, leaving the sea heaving but no longer trying actively to kill us, we collapsed where we stood, soaked and shaking, alive in a way that felt almost like a victory after everything else that had gone wrong. I woke up the next morning at exactly 6:13, and for one terrible, disorienting moment, I thought perhaps the loop had finally broken, because surely, I told myself, a storm that violent could not simply repeat itself exactly as it had come. I climbed to the deck and found calm water, the fog thinner than before, the men beginning their day with the cautious optimism of survivors. It took until nearly dusk for the dread to return in full, when the same wall of black clouds began stacking on the same horizon, in the exact same formation I remembered from what my mind now insisted on calling yesterday, though the word itself had started to lose all meaning. We fought that storm again. Every wave hit us in the same sequence. Every scream from Danny came at the same moment. I found myself somewhere in the middle of the second repetition, anticipating each surge of water before it struck, calling out warnings to the crew a half-second before they needed them, and the look on Elias's face when he realized what I was doing, that I somehow knew what was coming before it came, was one of the most unsettling things I witnessed in that entire ordeal. He didn't ask me how. I think he already understood, on some level, that questions like that no longer had useful answers. By the fourth time we lived through that exact storm, something had shifted in me that I struggled to name at the time. I no longer fought the waves with the same desperate fear. I moved through the chaos with a strange, hollow calm, knowing precisely which handhold to grab, which moment to duck, which order to give and when. The men noticed. Thomas asked me once, his voice raw with exhaustion and something close to awe, how I could stand there so steady while the world tried to tear itself apart around us. I didn't have an honest answer for him that didn't sound insane, so I said nothing, and he didn't push further. It was during the fifth repetition of that storm that Danny broke down for the first time. He had always been the youngest, the most tender-hearted among us, and I watched something inside him crack as the same lightning split the same sky in the same pattern he had now memorized against his will. He screamed, not in fear of the storm itself, but in a kind of anguished protest against the impossibility of living through the same terror again and again with no end in sight. Elias held him against the wheelhouse wall, speaking low words I couldn't hear over the wind, and I remember feeling, for the first time, a helplessness as a captain that no training had prepared me for. I began keeping a private log during those repeated storms, scribbled in whatever moments I found, cataloging every detail I could remember from each iteration, hoping desperately that some small variation, some crack in the pattern, might reveal itself if I studied closely enough. Elias started doing the same without my asking, and we compared notes during the brief calm hours between storms, two men trying to apply logic and observation to something that seemed to mock the very idea of logic. We found nothing conclusive in those early comparisons, only the growing, suffocating certainty that we were prisoners of a pattern we did not yet understand. By what I believe was the seventh time enduring that same storm, note for note, wave for wave, I stood at the helm, and, for reasons I still cannot fully explain, I began speaking aloud into the wind and rain, not praying exactly, but reasoning, arguing, demanding to know why we were being held here, what purpose this repetition served, who, or what, was responsible for trapping 5 ordinary men in a loop of fear with no apparent end. I did not expect an answer. I received only the storm's indifferent roar in reply, but I would come to learn, many repetitions later, that somewhere out there in the dark water beneath us, something had already begun to hear me. Somewhere around what I calculated as the second week, though counting had become an act of faith rather than certainty by then, I began noticing something the others did not seem to share, Small details within the repeating day had started to shift, almost imperceptibly, like hairline fractures spreading across a pane of glass that still looked whole from a distance. A coffee cup that should have been on the left side of the galley table sat instead on the right. A knot in the rigging tied slightly differently than I remembered tying it the day or days before. I said nothing about these at first, afraid that speaking them aloud would confirm what I feared most, that I alone was beginning to come unmoored from whatever mechanism governed our repeating world. The first time I mentioned it to Elias, he looked at me with an expression I couldn't quite read, somewhere between concern and recognition. He admitted, after a long pause, that he too had noticed small inconsistencies, though his were different from mine, a word Thomas said differently. One loop, a shadow falling at a slightly wrong angle during another. We began comparing our observations in hushed conversations away from the younger men, trying to determine whether these cracks meant the loop was weakening or whether they meant something far more unsettling. That whatever controlled this repetition was not perfectly precise, that it too might be capable of error or perhaps of intention. Thomas seemed entirely unaware that anything at all had changed between repetitions, living each day as though it were genuinely new to him, his jokes landing with the same rhythm, his laughter arriving at the same moments. Danny, by contrast, had begun to show signs of a deep and creeping despair, his eyes hollow, his movements sluggish, a young man who had started to understand, in his bones, if not yet in words, that something about his experience of time had broken in a way he could not repair through willpower alone. Walt kept mostly to himself, burying his growing fear in engine maintenance that no longer needed doing, running diagnostics on systems that reported clean every single time. I started to test the cracks deliberately, choosing to act differently on purpose during one particular repetition, to see whether small deviations in my own behavior might ripple outward into larger changes in the day around us. I skipped my morning coffee entirely one loop, choosing instead to sit alone at the bow and watch the fog for the first hour of the day, rather than following my usual routine. Nothing catastrophic happened as a result. No alarms sounded, no force intervened to correct my behavior. But I did notice, later that same loop, that Thomas told a slightly different joke than usual, as though my small deviation had nudged something else out of its groove entirely. This discovery filled me with a strange and dangerous kind of hope. If my actions could alter small details within the loop, perhaps larger actions could alter larger outcomes. Perhaps the pattern was not an unbreakable law, but something closer to a river current, resistant, but not entirely immovable if pushed hard enough in the right direction. I began experimenting more boldly over the following repetitions, changing our heading earlier in the day, delaying the storm preparations, even attempting once to simply refuse to go to sleep at all, staying awake straight through what should have been the boundary between one loop and the next. That particular experiment produced the strangest result of all. I remained awake, watching the clock tick past midnight, past 1, past 2, determined to witness firsthand whatever mechanism reset our world each morning at 6:13. As the hour approached, I felt an overwhelming, almost physical pressure building in the air around me, a sensation not unlike the moment before a held breath finally releases. And despite every effort of will I could summon, my eyes grew impossibly heavy. My thoughts slowed and thickened like syrup, until darkness took me entirely against my conscious wishes. I woke at 6:13 exactly as always, having lost the fight against whatever force governed our reset, but having learned, at least, that the boundary itself was enforced by something with intention behind it. I shared this discovery with Elias alone, unwilling yet to burden the younger men with the full weight of what it implied. If something forced sleep upon me against my will at the exact threshold of each reset, then we were not simply victims of a natural or accidental phenomenon. Something was managing this loop actively, deliberately, with a purpose we could not yet see. Elias sat with this information for a long while before responding, his eyes fixed on the fog beyond the wheelhouse window. And finally, he said the words that I had been too afraid to speak myself. Someone is doing this to us on purpose, Raymond. The question is why. We began to search the ship more thoroughly after that conversation, looking for anything unusual, any sign of tampering, any explanation grounded in the world we understood. We found nothing out of place, no hidden device, no evidence of sabotage from any human source, and yet, during our search, I noticed something that had escaped me before. A faint metallic sound occasionally drifting up from beneath the hull, rhythmic, almost musical, unlike any sound the ocean or our own engine could produce. I mentioned it to Elias, and he admitted he had heard it too, on more than one occasion, but had dismissed it as an echo of our own machinery reflecting off something below. That night, unable to sleep despite my exhaustion, I lay in my bunk listening intently for that sound, and I heard it again, closer this time, or perhaps simply clearer, a slow, rhythmic pulse that reminded me, uncomfortably, of a heartbeat, vast and deliberate, coming from somewhere far beneath the keel of my ship. I did not wake the others. I lay there in the dark, listening to that impossible sound, feeling for the first time not fear exactly, but a strange and vertiginous curiosity, as though some part of me understood that whatever produced that sound was not hostile in the way a storm or a predator is hostile, but was instead simply old, patient, and waiting for something none of us yet understood. I woke up the next morning at exactly 6:13, and before I even opened my eyes, I found myself straining to remember whether I had heard that pulse in my dreams or in waking life, the line between the two having grown thinner with every repetition we endured. I climbed to the deck to find Danny sitting alone at the bow, staring down into water that had gone strangely still and clear despite the fog above. And when I asked him what he was looking at, he told me, in a voice barely above a whisper, that he thought he had seen a light moving beneath the surface, deep down, slow and steady, like something enormous turning over in its sleep. There are nights at sea that feel merely dark, and then there are nights that feel like the absence of light has become a living thing pressing down against your skin. The night I am about to describe belonged entirely to the second kind. It came, by my best reckoning, sometime near what would have been our third week trapped in that endless repeating day, though by then I had largely stopped trying to count with any precision, trusting instead the deeper, wordless sense that something was changing, building toward whatever purpose the loop had always been serving. That evening, the fog thinned in a way it had not done before, not clearing entirely, but pulling back just enough to reveal a sky utterly devoid of stars. I had sailed enough nights in my life to know the difference between a sky obscured by cloud and a sky that was simply inexplicably empty, black in a way that felt less like darkness and more like absence, as though someone had reached up and erased the heavens themselves. Elias stood beside me at the rail, and I heard him exhale slowly, a sound that carried more dread in it than any words could have managed. The temperature dropped sharply within the span of perhaps 20 minutes, a cold that had nothing to do with wind or season, a cold that seemed to rise up from the water itself, seeping through the hull and into our bones. Danny came up from below wrapped in 2 blankets, his teeth chattering, asking if anyone else felt it, and Thomas, uncharacteristically silent, simply nodded rather than offering one of his usual jokes to lighten the mood. Walt reported that the engine, for the first time in the entire ordeal, had begun running rough, sputtering in a way that made no mechanical sense, given how thoroughly he had maintained it. Then, one by one, our instruments began to fail. The GPS display flickered and went dark. The compass needle spun uselessly, no longer settling on any heading at all. The radio, which had produced nothing but static since the fog first descended weeks before, fell entirely silent, not even the faint hiss of empty airwaves remaining. I stood in the wheelhouse surrounded by dead screens and useless dials, feeling a helplessness deeper than anything the storms had ever produced in me. Because a storm, at least, was something the sea itself understood. This was something else, something that made the ocean feel suddenly, terrifyingly irrelevant. The metallic pulse I had heard beneath the hull on previous nights grew louder, no longer faint or easily dismissed, but resonating clearly through the entire structure of the ship, a slow, deliberate rhythm that I could feel in my chest as much as hear with my ears. Danny grabbed my arm, his young face white with terror, asking me what was happening, and I had no honest answer to give him, only the instruction to stay calm, to stay together, to trust that whatever was coming, we would face it as a crew rather than as 5 separate frightened men. The water around the meridian went unnaturally still, the waves that had rocked us gently for weeks, flattening out into a surface so calm it looked almost solid, like black glass stretching in every direction until it disappeared into that starless dark. I had never in my career witnessed the ocean fall so completely silent, and the silence itself felt wrong, felt like a predator holding its breath before a strike. And every man on that deck seemed to sense it at the same moment, drawing closer together instinctively near the wheelhouse, as though proximity to one another might offer some protection against whatever was approaching. I remember Elias gripping the rail with both hands, his knuckles white, staring out into that flat black water, and I remember asking him, quietly, whether he thought this was the moment we had been waiting for without knowing it, the moment the loop had always been building toward. He didn't answer with words. He simply nodded once, slowly, his eyes never leaving the water. And in that nod, I understood that he felt exactly what I felt, a certainty beyond logic that something enormous was about to reveal itself to us. Walt came up from the engine room then, his face streaked with sweat despite the plummeting temperature, reporting that the engine had died entirely, not sputtered, not stalled, but simply stopped, as though some external will had reached in and switched it off with the same casual ease a man might use to flip a light switch. We were now, for all practical purposes, entirely at the mercy of whatever force had orchestrated the 90-some days we had already lived through in fragments, unable to move, unable to communicate, unable to do anything but wait in that impossible silence for whatever came next. Tomas broke the silence eventually, his voice small and stripped of all its usual bravado, asking simply, "Is this it? Are we going to die out here?" I told him no, though I had no real basis for that reassurance beyond a stubborn refusal to let fear win before we understood what we were actually facing. Danny began to cry quietly, not from panic exactly, but from a bone-deep exhaustion of spirit that I recognized in myself as well. The particular grief of a person who has been afraid for so long that even fresh terror arrives, wrapped in weariness rather than adrenaline. And then, somewhere above the flat black water, in that starless and silent sky, a light appeared. Not the flash of lightning, not the beam of a passing vessel, but something vast and slow, a glow that seemed to unfold gradually across the darkness like a bruise spreading beneath skin, growing steadily larger and closer. And every man aboard the Meridian stood frozen at the rail, watching, unable to speak, unable to move, as whatever had been waiting beneath us and around us for 97 repeating days, finally began to reveal itself. I have tried, in the 11 years since that night, to find words that could truly capture what came down out of that starless sky, and I have never succeeded. Not fully, not in a way that satisfies even my own memory of the event. The light did not simply grow brighter as it approached. It grew larger in a way that defied every instinct I had built over 2 decades of judging distance and scale on open water. What I had first mistaken for a distant glow revealed itself, as it drew nearer, to be the underside of something so vast that my mind refused, for several long seconds, to process it as a single solid object at all. It moved without sound, which was perhaps the most unsettling detail of everything that followed. A ship of that size, had it existed in any form I understood, would have displaced air with a roar, would have driven waves ahead of it, would have announced itself through every sense a sailor relies upon. Instead, it simply arrived, gliding silently overhead until it blotted out what little starlight might have existed beyond the strange darkness that had already claimed our sky, casting the entire meridian into a shadow deeper than any night I had ever experienced. A darkness with edges, a darkness that had a shape. Danny screamed first, a raw and involuntary sound torn from somewhere beneath conscious thought, and within seconds all of us were shouting, though I could not tell you now what any of us actually said, only that the panic that gripped the crew in those first moments was total and complete. The kind of fear that strips away rank and reason alike and leaves only animal instinct behind. Thomas dropped to the deck, covering his head with both arms, as though bracing for an impact that never came. Walt froze entirely, staring upward with his mouth open, no sound coming out of him at all. I do not remember consciously deciding to stay at the helm rather than run for cover, but some instinct rooted deep in my training as captain kept my hands on the wheel even though the engine had long since died, and steering meant nothing at all in that moment. I looked up into that impossible shadow and saw, faintly, a pattern of lights along its underside, arranged in configurations that meant nothing to me, pulsing slowly in a rhythm that matched, with a precision that turned my blood to ice, the exact metallic heartbeat we had been hearing beneath the hull for days. The temperature continued to drop until our breath came out in visible clouds, and a pressure settled over the ship that I can only compare to the feeling of diving too deep too fast. An ache behind the eyes, a ringing in the ears, a sense that the very air had thickened around us. Elias grabbed my shoulder and shouted something I could not hear over the pounding of my own pulse. And when I turned to look at him, I saw in his face the same mixture of terror and awe that I imagine was written across my own. 2 men who had spent their entire lives believing they understood the ocean, confronted suddenly with proof of how little they actually knew. The vessel above us, if vessel is even the right word for something that defied every category I had for such things, began to descend slowly. The shadow it cast growing tighter and more absolute around the meridian, until I felt certain it intended to crush us beneath its impossible bulk. I shouted for the men to brace, though I had no idea what bracing against something like this could possibly accomplish, and I remember gripping the wheel so tightly that my knuckles ached for days afterward, a small human gesture of control in the face of something that made control laughably irrelevant. It stopped its descent perhaps 100 feet above the water, close enough that the strange lights along its hull illuminated our deck in a pale, shifting glow unlike any color I have ever been able to properly name, somewhere between silver and violet, a color that seemed to exist slightly outside the normal range of what human eyes are built to perceive. Danny had gone entirely silent by then, curled against the base of the mast, his eyes wide and fixed upward, and Thomas had finally lowered his arms from his head, staring in a kind of stunned paralysis at the impossible thing hovering above us. Walt found his voice first, though what emerged was barely more than a whisper, asking me directly, "Captain, what do we do?" A question I had no honest answer for, because nothing in my training, nothing in my 20 years of experience, Nothing in any story I had ever heard from other sailors in dockside bars had prepared me for a moment like this one. I told him, and all of them, to stay together, to stay calm, though my own voice shook as I said it. And I understood in that moment that whatever authority I held as captain was largely ceremonial now, a comfort we all clung to rather than a genuine source of guidance. The metallic pulse we had heard beneath the hull for weeks grew louder still, resonating now not just through the water, but through the very air around us, vibrating in my chest, in my teeth, in the marrow of my bones. And beneath the ship, the water began to glow faintly, the same pale silver-violet light spreading outward from directly beneath our keel, illuminating shapes moving in the depths that I could not, and still cannot, fully describe, vast and slow and utterly foreign to anything the ocean had ever shown me in all my years upon it. And then, as suddenly as it had begun, the pulse stopped entirely, plunging the ship into a silence so complete it felt like the world itself had stopped breathing. And in that silence, standing at the center of our deck, though none of us had seen it arrive, something began to take shape, a presence forming itself out of that pale, strange light. Humanoid in outline, but wrong in every proportion. My mind tried to assign to it, and I understood, with a certainty that settled over me like a physical weight, that whatever had been governing our repeating days for 97 cycles had finally come to stand before us directly. I want to be as precise as I can about what I saw that night, because I know precisely how it sounds, and I know precisely what it has cost me to describe it honestly in the years since. The figure that appeared at the center of our deck stood perhaps 7 feet tall, though its proportions shifted subtly as I looked at it, as though my eyes could not quite settle on a single fixed shape, the way a reflection in disturbed water refuses to hold still no matter how hard you stare. Its skin, if skin is even the correct word, seemed to hold that same pale silver-violet luminescence that had spread through the water beneath us, not glowing exactly, but existing at the edge of light in a way that made it difficult to look at directly for more than a few seconds. None of us moved. None of us spoke. Danny had stopped crying entirely, staring up at the figure with an expression that had passed beyond terror into something closer to a child's wide, uncomprehending wonder. Thomas had gotten slowly to his feet, his earlier bravado entirely gone, replaced by a stillness I had never seen in him before. Elias stood beside me, his hand still gripping my shoulder from before, and I could feel, through that grip, the tremor running through his entire body, though whether from fear or something else entirely, I could not say, because I felt that same tremor running through my own. The being turned its head, or what passed for a head, slowly toward each of us in turn, and I had the distinct and overwhelming sensation of being seen in a way I had never been seen before, not merely observed, but understood completely. Every fear I carried, every doubt, every private grief I had never spoken aloud to another living soul, laid bare before something that regarded all of it without judgment, the way a doctor might regard an X-ray, clinically, thoroughly, without cruelty, but also without the softening comfort of ordinary human sympathy. It did not speak, not with a mouth, not with any sound at all. Instead, images began to form in my mind, unbidden, vivid, more real than memory, and I understood somehow that the other men were experiencing something similar, because I watched their faces shift in response to visions only they could see. I saw, in rapid succession, images of the ocean floor stretching back across ages I could not begin to number. Vast structures buried beneath sediment, cities perhaps, or something that served a similar purpose, built by hands, or whatever the equivalent might be, long before anything resembling a human being had walked upright on dry land. I saw ships, countless ships across countless centuries, wooden hulls and iron hulls, sailors in clothing from eras I recognized only from history books, all of them passing through this same stretch of water, this same dead reach, some passing safely through, untouched, and others, a smaller number but still more than I wanted to imagine, drawn into the same repeating pattern we ourselves had endured, some for days, some, according to the images that flickered through my mind, for what felt like years before finally being released back into the ordinary flow of time. I tried to speak, to ask the question burning through every part of me. Why us? Why now? What do you want? And though my mouth moved and sound came out, I could not tell if the being understood spoken language at all, because its response came not in words, but in another wave of images, this time focused specifically on our own ship, our own crew, showing me moments from the past 97 days that I recognized instantly. The storm repeated 7 times, the fog, the coin. Danny turned over and over in his nervous fingers, every detail observed, cataloged, studied with a patience that felt older than the concept of patience itself. Elias, beside me, made a sound I had never heard him make before, something between a gasp and a sob, and when I glanced at him, tears were running freely down his weathered face, though his eyes remained fixed on the being before us, transfixed, unable to look away even as whatever visions passed through his own mind clearly moved him to depths of emotion I had never witnessed in him across all our years sailing together. I understood, without being told directly, that each of us was receiving something slightly different, tailored perhaps to what we most needed to understand, or perhaps to what we were most capable of comprehending, given the limits of our separate minds. Thomas spoke then, his voice shaking but clear, asking the being if it intended to kill us, if this was some manner of judgment being passed upon us for reasons we could not fathom. In response, an image formed in all our minds simultaneously, one I will remember with perfect clarity until the day I die. An image of gentle hands, though hands is not quite the right word, cupping something small and fragile, protecting it rather than crushing it. And I understood then, with a wave of relief so powerful it nearly buckled my knees, that whatever we had endured had never been intended as punishment or malice, but as something else entirely, something closer to a test, or perhaps closer still to a kind of quarantine. Danny finally spoke, his young voice small and trembling, asking simply, "Are you real?" A question so achingly human in its simplicity that it seemed to momentarily still even the being before us, and in response, it extended one long, impossibly proportioned limb toward him, not touching him, simply gesturing in his direction, and an image formed in my mind of countless beings, just like this one, or perhaps this very one, existing and observing across a span of time so vast that human history occupied only the smallest, most recent sliver of it, present on this world, in these waters, long before the first human eyes ever looked up at the stars and wondered what watched back. I stood there on the deck of my own ship, surrounded by my terrified and awestruck crew, facing something that had clearly existed on this earth since long before humanity itself, and I felt, beneath all the fear, a strange and unexpected calm settling over me, the same calm I imagine comes to a man who has spent his entire life asking unanswerable questions and finds himself, at last, in the presence of something that might actually hold the answers, even if those answers arrived not in words, but in visions that would take me the rest of my life to fully understand. What followed, I have come to understand only slowly, over years of turning it over in my mind, the way a man worries a stone smooth in his pocket. The being before us, having shown each of us fragments of its own understanding, began to reveal something larger, a pattern woven not just through our 97 days, but through the entire history of that patch of ocean. And I received it not as a story told in sequence, the way I am telling it to you now, but as a single overwhelming impression that I have had to translate imperfectly into the shape of words in the years since. The dead reach, I came to understand, was never simply a stretch of water with unlucky currents and stubborn fog. It was, and I believe still is, a kind of threshold, a place where the boundary between what we understand as time and whatever governs the true nature of existence grows thin, worn down by forces that predate not just humanity, but likely predate the ocean itself in its current form. The being and others like it had maintained a presence there, watching, waiting, tending to that threshold, the way a lighthouse keeper tends a lamp, for a length of time so vast that human civilization, every empire, every war, every love story ever told, amounted to little more than a single flickering moment within it. I understood, through the images that continued to unfold in my mind, that not every ship drawn into that repeating loop of days was released. Some, according to what I was shown, remained trapped for reasons I could not fully grasp, whether through some failure to demonstrate whatever quality the loop was testing for, or through some other mechanism I lacked the framework to comprehend. I saw glimpses of vessels from centuries past, their crews long since passed from any living memory, and I understood, with a chill that had nothing to do with the temperature around us, that our own fate had not been guaranteed from the moment we first entered those waters. The being showed me, and I believe showed each of us in our own way, that the loop had been testing something specific in how we responded to prolonged, repeated, hopeless-seeming adversity. It was not testing our strength in the way a storm tests strength, not our physical endurance or our skill with the sea, but something closer to the resilience of the bonds between us, whether we would turn on each other in fear and desperation, or whether we would hold together as something worth preserving. I saw, in the images shown to me, moments from our 97 days that I had lived through myself, Elias holding Danny against the wheelhouse wall during the 5th repeated storm, Walt tending the engine long after any rational hope of it mattering had faded, myself standing at the helm shouting into the wind, refusing to let despair take full hold even when every instrument told me we were trapped beyond any reasonable escape. I understood that we had, in whatever manner mattered to whatever intelligence governed that threshold, passed the test the ocean had set before us. Though I want to be honest and say that even now, 11 years later, I do not fully understand the criteria by which such a judgment was made, only that it was made, and that it had allowed us to reach this moment, standing on our own deck, face to face with a truth no man is meant to carry easily. The being conveyed, in a final and overwhelming wave of understanding, that we would be released, that the loop would end, that we would return to the ordinary flow of time and carry this experience with us for the remainder of our lives. But it conveyed something else as well, something that settled into me with far greater weight than the relief of our impending release. It showed me that there would be limits placed upon what I could share of this encounter once I returned to the world of ordinary men, limits I did not fully understand, even as I felt them settle into place somewhere deep within my own mind, like a hand pressed gently but firmly against a door that would only ever open part way. I understood that I would remember everything that mattered, but that certain details, certain specific truths about what these beings were, where they came from, and what their true purpose here entailed, would remain sealed away from me, accessible only in fragments, in feelings, in half-formed impressions that would surface at unexpected moments for the rest of my life. I tried to protest this, tried to demand, in whatever manner one demands anything of a being that communicates through visions rather than words, a fuller explanation, a complete accounting of what had happened to us and why. The response I received was not unkind, but it was final. An image of the ocean itself, vast and ancient, holding countless depths that no single lifetime could ever fully explore. And I understood that what I was being shown was not cruelty, but a kind of mercy, that some truths were simply too large for a human mind to hold without breaking under their weight. The way a hull not built for the deepest pressure will eventually buckle and fail, no matter how skilled its construction. Elias, beside me, seemed to receive a similar understanding in his own way, because he nodded slowly, tears still wet on his weathered face, accepting something I could see he did not entirely welcome, but recognized as unavoidable. Thomas stood with his arms wrapped around himself, staring at the being with an expression I can only describe as grief. Grief for an understanding he sensed, slipping away from him even as it was being offered. Danny alone seemed to find something like peace in what was being shown to him, his young face calm for the first time in what felt like a lifetime of repeated days. And Walt simply stood silent, absorbing whatever private vision had been reserved specifically for him. The being conveyed one final thing before the light around it began to dim, an impression that has never left me in all the years since, that we had not been chosen at random, that something about each of us, individually and together as a crew bound by trust, had marked our vessel as worth the testing, worth the 97 days of fear and repetition, and that we would carry, whether we wished to or not, a permanent thread of connection to that threshold and to whatever intelligence tended it, a thread that would never fully sever, no matter how many years or how many miles separated us from that patch of dark and ancient water. I felt the pressure in the air begin to lift, the impossible cold beginning to recede, and above us, the vast, silent shape that had blotted out the stars began, slowly, to withdraw upward into a sky that was already, impossibly, beginning to show the faint returning light of stars scattered across black velvet, as though the universe itself was exhaling after holding its breath alongside us for the entirety of our ordeal. And I understood, standing there on the deck of my own ship surrounded by my exhausted, changed, and forever marked crew, that whatever we had just witnessed was ending, but that its presence in our lives, in my life most of all, was only just beginning. I woke the next morning, if morning is even the right word for what followed, not at 6:13, but at 9:15, sprawled across the deck, where I had apparently collapsed sometime after the light in the sky finally vanished entirely. The sun was out, genuinely out, warm and golden, and utterly unlike anything we had seen in 97 days. And the fog that had held us prisoner for so long had simply ceased to exist, as though it had never been there at all, replaced by a horizon so clear and so ordinary that for a long moment I could not trust my own eyes. Elias woke a few feet away from me, and then Thomas, then Walt, each of them rising slowly, disoriented, blinking against sunlight. None of us had felt properly in longer than any of us could accurately measure. Danny was already awake, sitting quietly at the bow, watching the water, the way a man watches something he has grown to love and fear in equal measure. Our instruments, when I finally forced myself to check them, worked perfectly, the GPS reporting a position nearly 60 miles from where we had first dropped anchor, as though the ship itself had drifted freely through open water, while its crew lived through an ordeal that time, apparently, had not fully accounted for. Getting home took another 3 days of ordinary sailing, 3 days that felt almost unbearably strange in their normalcy, the sun rising and setting properly, each day distinct from the one before it, a gift none of us had expected to appreciate so deeply until it was returned to us. We spoke little during that journey home, each man processing what we had witnessed in his own private way, though I noticed something had shifted permanently among us, a closeness forged in those 97 repeated days that no ordinary voyage could have produced, a bond I still feel today, even though only Elias and I remain in regular contact all these years later. The reception we received back on land was not what any of us had hoped for. I will not pretend the years since have been kind to my reputation. I told the story honestly, plainly, exactly as I have told it to you tonight, and I was met first with disbelief, then with pity, and eventually with the diagnosis that has followed me ever since, the label that reduces an entire ordeal, an entire transformation, into a convenient clinical explanation that lets other people sleep soundly without having to reconsider anything they believe about the world. I do not blame them entirely. I understand how the story sounds. I have had 11 years to understand exactly how it sounds, and I have chosen to tell it anyway. What I have never been able to explain to doctors, to family, to the handful of people who still speak to me with anything resembling patience, is the sensation that has never fully left me since that night. The feeling of being watched, gently, without malice, by something that remains present just beyond the edge of my understanding. I have had dreams, vivid and specific, that seem to fill in small pieces of the larger truth, the being withheld from me, only to find those details slipping away upon waking, like water through fingers, leaving behind only the certainty that something real had been there, without the substance of what it actually was. There have been moments, more than I can count, where I have started to explain a detail to someone, a friend, a reporter who once took interest in the story, even a therapist assigned to help manage what everyone insists on calling my condition, only to feel that same gentle but immovable pressure I first felt the night I tried to stay awake through our reset, a wordless resistance that stops the words in my throat before they can fully form. I have come to accept, however uncomfortably, that I am permitted to tell this story only up to a certain point, that some door remains only partly open, and that whatever intelligence governs that limit has decided, for reasons I still do not fully understand, that certain truths are not yet mine to give away. Elias and I still speak on the phone most months, and we have never once, in 11 years, doubted each other's account of what happened, even when the rest of the world doubted us both. Thomas moved away not long after, married, had children, and though we exchange a card at Christmas, I sense he has built a quiet peace by simply not discussing that voyage aloud, and I do not begrudge him that choice. Walt passed a few years back, quietly, and I like to believe that whatever understanding he received that night gave him some measure of comfort in his final years, though he too rarely spoke of it after we returned to land. Danny, the last I heard, still fishes these waters, though he never again sails near the dead reach, and I don't think he ever will. As for me, I am still here, still telling this story to whoever will listen, still watching the horizon some nights with a feeling I cannot fully name, somewhere between fear and longing, the sense that something vast and ancient and patient continues to watch these waters, tending whatever threshold it has tended since long before the first human ship ever dared to cross this ocean. I do not know if I will ever be called back to that place. Part of me hopes I never am. Part of me, the part that has never stopped feeling that faint, metallic pulse somewhere beneath my ribs on quiet nights, wonders if the choice was ever really mine to make. So here is what I can tell you, the whole of what I am permitted to say, and I offer it not as proof, because I have none that would satisfy a skeptical mind, but as testimony, freely given by a man who has nothing left to gain from lying and everything left to lose by staying silent. They are here. They have been here far longer than we have. They do not wish us harm, not in any way I could ever perceive, but they are watching, testing, waiting for something I cannot name, and somewhere out past the edge of the fog, in waters that still bear a name only fishermen dare to whisper, that ancient patience continues, indifferent to our disbelief, indifferent to the label they've hung around my neck, indifferent to everything except whatever quiet purpose has kept it waiting there, since before the first star ever rose over an empty and unclaimed sea.